Good evening, everyone. My name is Jara Patrick, and I'm the director and curator at the La Warsaw Gallery. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for tonight's conversation, Radical Rococo, led by Yvette Mayorga and Jillian Hernandez. Before we welcome our guests, I'd like to take a moment to honor the fact that many of us in attendance occupy native land. Here in Minneapolis and St. Paul, we're on Dakota land, and this is the ancestral home of the Dakota, Ojibwe, and Ho-Chunk people who were forcibly exiled from this land because of aggressive and persistent settler colonialism. We make this acknowledgement to honor the Dakota people, our ancestors and descendants, as well as the land itself. And I know that many of you are joining us from across the country this evening, and we'd like to encourage you to take a moment to honor the histories and peoples of the region that you are viewing from. If you'd like more resources on these histories, native-land.ca is a really great place to start. So this evening's program is presented in conjunction with Yvette Mayorga's remote residency through the La Warsaw Gallery at Macalester College. The La Warsaw Gallery is closed to the public this past spring as a part of Macalester College's response to COVID-19 to keep our environment safe for our students, staff, and faculty. Our gallery space remains closed and Macalester College is not open to visitors at this time. In lieu of a brick and mortar exhibition program, this fall, we hosted a remote residency with Yvette. During her residency, Yvette's been working on the expansion of an ongoing project called Monuments of the Forgotten, a catalog to chronicle this body of work along with a broader body of work called Monochromatic Dreams. And we'll also be working on public programs with local and national guests. And so I'm pleased to welcome you to the first of these programs, Radical Rococo, Pink as a Weapon of Mass Destruction, which is going to be an intimate conversation between Yvette and Dr. Jillian Hernandez. We'd like to thank the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies for their co-sponsorship of this event. And hopefully some of those folks are in attendance this evening as well. So the program will be formatted as follows. I'll introduce both of our guests. They'll engage in conversation for about 45 minutes. At which time we will take questions from the audience. I'd like to ask that all questions are sent to me by way of chat. So make sure to locate your chat box and submit questions in that manner. That way, I hope to get to all these questions, but that will also allow me to moderate them to ensure that they are the best to serve our discussion, both for content and for time allowances. In addition, this conversation will be recorded and shared at a later time through the La Warsaw Gallery's channels along with our guest channels. So it's now my pleasure to welcome our guests. Yvette Mayorga is a multimedia artist. She boldly engages viewers in socio-political dialogue centered on the immigrant experience in the US by fusing confectionery aesthetics with references to familiar labor. Mayorga holds an MFA in Fiber and Material Studies from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She's exhibited at the Vincent Price Art Museum, Expo Chicago, Untitled Art Fair, Art Design Chicago, LACMA's Pacific Standard Time, the Chicago Artists Coalition, and the National Museum of Mexican American Art, along with Geary Contemporary. She's attended the Fountainhead Residency, the Bolt Residency, as a recipient of the Maker Grant. And in addition, she recently showed alongside Andy Warhol's exhibition through a commission by the Jahala Projects as part of the Art Institute of Chicago. She's been written about widely in the likes of Art Forum, ArtNet, and Art News, and she recently was acquired by the DePaul Art Museum. We're also joined by Dr. Jillian Hernandez, who is a scholar, community arts educator, curator, and creative who works out of Gainesville, Florida. Her work is inspired by Black and Latinx life and imagination. And she's invested in challenging how working class bodies, sexualities, and cultural practices are policed through gendered tropes of deviancy and respectability. She studies Blackness and Latinidad as relational formations, and it attends to the political, cultural, and communal dynamics of aesthetic production. Dr. Hernandez is an assistant professor in the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies and Research at the University of Florida. Her recent book, Aesthetics of Excess, The Art and Politics of Black and Latina Embodiment, was released in this past fall, 2020, through Duke University Press. Yes, it's now my pleasure to give space to our guests, and I'm going to recede And I'm actually gonna have the rest of us recede so that we can enjoy this intimate conversation.
Thank you so much, Jira, for those wonderful introductions. I'm so honored to be sharing space with you, Jill, and to have a conversation on the aesthetics and how pink can be a weapon of mass destruction.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you also to Jara for this space. And you know, anytime to dialogue with Yvette is a big thrill for me. Yvette's work, I learned about Yvette's work in 2016, and it was shortly after the election of 45. And I had recently had my son, and he was small, and I remember scrolling through Instagram and seeing Yvette's work, and really feeling, I felt so helpless because I was like constantly breastfeeding and strapped to a rocking chair, and seeing your work really was just like this like radical vision that I could like access through my screen. And it was so wonderful to be able to like eventually connect with you and meet with you in Chicago and develop a friendship just through this, our mutual love of excess and pain.
Yes. No, and I felt the same way too when, you know, we had first met in Chicago, and it seems like so long ago and such a different time back then. I had a completely different studio. I think it was like 1/3 of the space that I have now. And, you know, I was just starting to paint again. So it was really like a monumental moment. I think now when I look back at the projection that I've gone now within my work. But yeah, the conversations that, you know, we started having about Nicki Minaj and Pink and the Rococo, and it was really exciting to start to engage your work, you know, and thinking about its relationship to my work, and how, you know, we were across the country, but interested in talking about you know, similar things, but through various media. I mean, I think I consider you to be also an artist with your work on, you know, with women on the rise, but, you know, through your text and um, through my installations and how they're in conversation naturally.
Absolutely. And I think that's what interested me a lot about this opportunity, and hopefully future ones, because I also think that more than I think just writing about artists, I'm really interested in also like going beyond that to collaborate. And I think that there's a way that um, we share, even though like our relationship to Latinidad is a little bit different. So coming from like a Caribbean background, and you have like a very intimate relationship to the US Mexico border that I don't have, but like those mutual spaces where Latinidad comes together for us, like in the aesthetic, like and in particular through these like domestic aesthetics, through these like feminized aesthetics that don't get taken seriously as art. And I think that's like a big thing that you talk about, like your family having this history of like working in crafts and confection practices that are not considered like high art, but that, you know, you in your statements really beautifully write about how like they should be called artists, right? And like this is artistic production. So that attention to like labor and the body and aesthetics, to me is a point where um I think like the way we come into gender and Latinidad has like a lot in common, even though we come from these like places that have very specific histories and different relationships to being othered in the US. There's still something shared. Like when I see your work, I think of like my abuelitas, right? So you know, it is, there are these places, even though I feel like Latinidad is very much a contested concept right now. Um, I do think that there are places where that mutual shared experience and aesthetic is actually really important. And I think the Trump administration made that like really clear.
Yeah, definitely. It makes me think right away about the chapter in your book about access, and how you talk about daydreaming in your grandmother's living room, and
Yes.
seeing the, the Rococo aesthetics of the living room, and and then referencing Melissa Hyde's quote, and thinking about Rococo as a space of resistance, and
Mm-hmm.
allowing for there to be a moment of dreaming.
Yes.
And I think it fits really beautifully with, as soon as I read that passage, I thought right away about the portrait of my parents
Mm-hmm.
that I painted, that's actually in Monochromatic Dreams, where I'm referencing the Rococo in the interior of the home, and like,
Mm-hmm.
the objects that reference the Rococo, and this idea that these objects hold value, although they're made of plastic and, widely affordable, also thinking about like the 99-cent store, and the reference, that you
Yes.
also talk about in your book with the Chonga aesthetics, and this very racialized, classist way of thinking about markers of Latinx.
Mm-hmm.
But how these sort of objects, and how this idea of the Rococo becomes a marker of, making it in America, or having a sort of having an indulgence within your home, similar to your car, but comparing the car and the inside of the home as this kind of space of dreaming, but a space that can signify wealth, or also that the voyage was worth it.
Yes. Absolutely. And um, I think that I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think that that's like one aspect that doesn't get talked about enough in conversations around immigration. I think there's still, like, I think in the wider imaginary, this idea that, migrants just come here and like everything is handed to them and they immediately access a better life. And I think that a lot of our families like shield us from conversations around like the difficulty and like the failure that also occurs. So like in the book I write about how like growing up we always said that we were middle class, and I always like thought, even going into adulthood, like, oh, we were middle class, and then looking back and being like, we totally were not middle class, like at all. But and in trying to figure out like why was that the narrative in my family, it's because like to have said working class would have been a sort of admission of failure, and in a way it's like to continue, right, like to just sort of face the next day. I think that through relying on like these signifiers that you're talking about, even these like mass produced like tchotchke rococo figures, it is a way to sort of like claim a space through consumption, right? And shout out to my dissertation advisor, Louisa Shine, who really, shaped my thinking around consumption, and how these like identity politics and like the politics of exclusion and inclusion sort of work through that. So I like that you mentioned cars, too, and like cars show up in your work. Um, the Rococo is definitely this space of like femininity. And one thing that Melissa Hyde, she's a feminist art historian, highly recommend her book, Making Up the Rococo. One thing that Melissa Hyde talks about, she has like this very capacious way of thinking about the Rococo as like beyond beyond a particular style. It's also a cultural mode of like dreaming about a different future. It's also a form of like queerness and like non-normative masculinity. So
Mhm.
one thing I had wanted to talk to you about, Yvette, is like I'm interested in like when men show up in your work, And so here we have the portrait of your parents. There's also in your 2017 project High Maintenance, we have images of cars, we have images of brown men with baseball caps and the Nike Cortez shoes that are hanging there on the left, right? Like you really play with this like lexicon of um sort of like masculine style and masculine signifiers, and then you place them in these like immersive pink installations. So can you just talk a little bit about like how you see masculinity, like how are you engaging men and masculinity through your work in this like hyper feminine Rococo language that you have?
Yeah, specifically in high maintenance, I was really interested in using objects such as shoes, also these visual cues like, references of my father in order to talk about the way in which he crossed the US-Mexico border in the 1970s inside of a car. And that's sort of where the immersion of my an iconographical reference to the pink Barbie car emerges with the Nike shoes. But I feel like I wasn't necessarily interested in depicting images of men or even an image of my dad specifically. So if you notice also in the portrait of him in the back of the installation in this image doesn't have any sort of facial signifiers that the person is a male. I think it's sort of my rejection of the art historical canon of being so male centric, and the way in which these feminized images of women are portrayed within paintings. And it's sort of my backlash to that, to not necessarily engage with an actual representation of a male specifically in my work, but maybe a little bit more nuance. And so that's where the presence of the Nike Cortez comes in as these kind of stand-ins to reference my father, to reference that crossing specifically. But I like to think that, through the way that I engage the female figure, that they sort of lend themselves to some, plays with power dynamics and some combination of like feminized masculine energy, where they're taking up these spaces that are like monumental, and they're taking up space, and they're taking back their power, specifically here in American landscape, where this statuesque of a female body that was kind of very like docile is then replaced by this figure that is representative of myself, of my body, that she's sort of taking the flag back in a way of reasserting that power. And you do see these moments where, bodies become part of the collage. But again, you can't necessarily see their face, but there are some cues that maybe point towards them being male. But I sort of like it that way, where they're kind of camouflaged and not necessarily not as important, but as visible as like the powerful image of the female's body within my work.
Right. So there's like a gender ambiguity that you're playing with. And so like if those masculine signifiers arise, then it's because like the viewer is bringing in this like gendered idea, right? So I'm already like, okay, I need to rethink the way I'm thinking about this. But that I love that though, because that really leaves it ambiguous. And so, one thing that I found really just interesting to learn about. So in my book, I have a chapter, and maybe we can pull up some of the Nicki images. My book has a chapter on Nicki Minaj, and I talk about the power of her aesthetics of fakery. So Nicki Minaj is the superstar hip hop artist who, for as much as she's celebrated and popular, is also someone who's very much vilified in popular discourse. There's like a lot of speculation about how much plastic surgery she's had and how she's modified her body to gain market success. And this has sort of framed her as like a social climber, someone who would like a sellout, someone who would basically like change themselves, right, for success. And as a Black woman, I think like those critiques become even more pointed because as her body transforms, there's also ways in which people are reading her body and assuming that if she's wearing a blonde wig that like she hates her Blackness or something, instead of seeing it as a play with fashion in the way that like Lady Gaga, who sort of rose around the same time that she did, was doing it. So through the community work I was doing with girls, like they would have these like impassioned debates. I would be while the girls were doing their art projects, they would like have these impassioned debates about like which parts of Nicki Minaj are fake and did Lil Wayne pay for her plastic surgery and like all this speculation about her. And it made me really interested in like really investigating this. And then around the same time, this issue of W magazine came out where the contemporary artist Francesco Vazzoli created a whole series of images of Nicki in Rococo style. And then I started to read Melissa Hyde's work and realized, you know, she talks about how the artists, like the male, you know, the 18th century male artists of the Rococo also were very much denigrated and also were very much seen as sellouts because, you know, the trope then was like, you know, real artists at this time, it's like you do historical narratives. You're supposed to work in like a neoclassical style, or you're referencing Greek mythology or whatever. And people, and we can go to the next slide, people like Francois Boucher in particular, were painting women like the Madame de Pompadour. And it was really mocked. It's like, it was this idea of like, if you're a male artist, why are you spending all your time painting these women? Right. And he was also denigrated for using the color pink. He was denigrated for showing images of women putting on their makeup. So Boucher was revolutionary in actually like creating an oil painting of a woman putting on makeup. Like that's actually like a thing that happens at this time. And it was not only the sort of idea of pink as less than and femininity as not valid art, but this idea too that like these women, just like Nicki Minaj, were seen as problematic. So a lot of them, like, so she was like a mistress of the king, and she would do her makeup in public. Like she would do her makeup in the company of the court, and that's really something that women are supposed to do, like hidden, right? And so it was this idea that like it was actually very much against gender conventions for a woman to like reveal herself, like putting herself together and putting her makeup on. And so it was interesting to me to see how these like how pink and Rococo could disempower white men who are like the most like white cis men, right, who are the most powerful, and then white women. And so for me it was really interesting, if we want to go to the next slide, to think about like Nicki through this work of Francesco Vazzoli, and excuse the weird image thing that's happening, you know, be placed within this like visual language that might seem like, oh, this is a really fun thing they're doing, putting Nicki in Rococo, but it actually is so fitting in so many ways, because Nicki has always claimed pink throughout her career, has always claimed Barbie and the Barbie aesthetics that like actually show up in your work too. And so there's this way in which I think like even for girls, and I think for Latina girls too, it's like we're not supposed to like Barbie. Like I think we're supposed to have like this narrative of being oppressed by Barbie and being oppressed by pink. So I think it's like it freaks both feminists and non-feminists out when you're like, oh no, I love pink, I love Barbie, like, and I still am feminist and all that. So do you want to talk a little bit too about like, have you ever felt pressure to distance yourself from these like feminine aesthetics, or from Barbie or from pink? Like have you faced those kinds of, you know, critiques that like serious art doesn't look this way?
Definitely. You know, and recalling, you know, back to that chapter in your book where you're talking about Barbie and the sort of neoliberal you know, power that Barbie has, and
Mhm.
how like she's so consumable, but she's just a sort of, you know, figure that kind of stands in for young, you know, girls to think that they can be empowered by her, but at the end of the day she's still part of this like larger capitalist neoliberal power structure. And it's so interesting, you know, thinking about that history, thinking about like Nicki Minaj, and then thinking about the way in which I'm using Barbie to subvert that, but also
Mhm.
to recognize that it was this object that was consumable to me, that I wanted in my girlhood, you know. And it's
Mhm.
this kind of stand-in for a car, you know, any
Mhm.
kind of car, this mode of transportation, as you know, that's the most sort of common way that people cross the border is inside in a car, and,
Mhm.
you know, in the interior of the car, you know, next to the engine and the seats. Um, but then, you know, this sort of stand-in uh, girlhood version of a car comes into the work to signify that. And I'm really interested in how uh, a toy, a girlhood toy like the Barbie car can hold so much power and weight. Seems so familiar, but then I can also use it as a vehicle to talk about like these, you know, traumatic racialized moments, and also moments in my family's history of, you know, being in this space right now. Um, and you know, it also makes me think about a question that I had for you about adornment on the
Mhm.
Latinx body, you know, talking about Nicki Minaj and the Rococo. Um, and, you know, thinking about, you know, if you see these sort of objects or moments of adornment on Latinx bodies as serving as a rejection of American idealistic beauty standards, while also acknowledging that, you know, what's sold to us as young girls, as women, can be um, can also be damaging, and wondering like, can they serve as moments of protest against these consumable ideas? And
I
that
love
leads into my, you know, my next question about, you know, asking you about the Latinx home, and you know, not being able to adorn your body. And if I can't adorn my body, then I can adorn the interior of my home.
yes. Yes. I love all of these questions. I think I'll start with the home and then go into the second
Yeah.
one actually, because I think that that's an interesting way to go about it. Um, so I love this question because, like I said, like in the Rococo chapter, I actually start off by describing my Cuban grandmother's home in particular. And I grew up in West New York, New Jersey, and my grandmother lived in this little like walk up townhouse, and super unassuming, like whatever, you wouldn't think anything of it when you would walk into this place. She had like velvet wallpaper with like metal, it was like metallic with then like the velvet
Mhm.
sort of fleur de lis, heavy velvet curtains, um chandeliers, crystal chandeliers, like the whole nine, right? And she worked as in a sweatshop, like sewing. And my grandfather would sell vegetables, like all around, like Caribbean vegetables, like yuca,
Mhm.
malanga, all that good stuff, to like bodegas in New Jersey and in New York. And so like, the form of labor that they did was not at all like matching with like what their home looked like. And I think
Mhm.
there's a way, and I talk about how like in the house you would have like this very like European aesthetic, and obviously like as a colonized island, that makes sense coming from Cuba.
Mhm.
But at the same time, you would have like next to a Rococo couple, you'd have like a big ceramic rooster, or like a little like figurine of ox, pulling like a wagon of sugarcane. And so like it was interesting to me that like images of like the rural farm life they had in Cuba and this like European aesthetic like all lived in the same space. And at the same time, like on the weekends when I would stay with my grandma, she would take me to the record store and I would buy like Janet Jackson records or Bananarama records and like put them on in the living room and like pretend that like, you know, the aesthetics reminded me of these kinds of like princess stories. So it was like this weird like accessing this like girlhood sexuality, sensuality, with popular culture within this like domestic space. And my grandmother's style, my Cuban grandmother's style, was actually like very low key. Like she would only wear makeup if there was like something special. My Puerto Rican grandmother though was like totally on point all the time. But she didn't put as much effort into her home. So to me, I think for my Cuban grandmother, I do think that the home adornment was a way to sort of play with sensuality and like the aesthetics of sensuality that perhaps she felt like she could not take on, or that she just maybe didn't desire to take on. My Cuban grandmother is also very much more like traditional. So like, you know, she's still married to my grandfather, and like my Puerto Rican grandmother that was much more into physical appearance was like single forever. So really interesting to think about that. So I do think there's something there in like, if I can't adorn my body, then like I will adorn my home, right? Um, and then the other question, about like the protest to the beauty aesthetics. I mean, I think it's a kind of like organic protest, right? Like I don't think, right, that like Latinas purposefully sort of make themselves up in certain ways, like thinking about resistance. But I do think that the effects of how they do dress themselves up, and I talk about like through these working class Latina girls called chongas, that even when they're not trying to challenge these like idealist, you know, white aesthetics, um, the way that they're received and the sort of aggressive way that they're looked at tells you that there's something irritating there. And I think the idea is like, I think the idea, and this also applies to like how African Americans are viewed too, is this idea that like, how dare you be racialized and working class and have pride in yourself? Like, how dare you? Right? Like you're supposed to be meek, you're supposed to feel ashamed. You're also, I think, as poor working class, supposed to like, you're not supposed to indulge in like Nike Cortezes or customizing your car, right? Like those are not things like you're supposed to sort of, you know, show that you are suffering and are sacrificing, because if you do indulge in these things, then that's the reason that you get blamed for being poor, right? It's like for what you consume. Whereas like we don't have the larger conversation of like, no, you're poor because of systematic racism, capitalism, globalization, etc. It's like, oh no, you're poor because you have like a Chanel bag.
Right. Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah, the way like that just to me was so profound when I was reading that paragraph about you being in your grandmother's living room and thinking about the way in which these objects have really formed my understanding of art. You know, I always think that really that the Catholic Church here in the US and in Mexico was like the first art museum that I ever visited, because it was, you know, up until I was 18 years old. And there was something about my unknowingly like a attraction to these paintings, these white female male bodies, you know, that to me really I had no sort of reference points to enter, like why they were here, why were they inside of the church, like what was their meaning. There was just something so indulgent about seeing them every Sunday and like questioning and wanting to know more. And to me, that's my entry point in, you know, in thinking about the Rococo and being interested in referencing the Rococo within my work, but also my site of my home as the same kind of place where I remember like my aunt, you know, had these like catalogs that she would bring, you know, from California to my mom, and to view and order these Rococo paintings, these Rococo clocks. these like floral arrangements for your table, for your living room table, your dining room
With like
table.
the fake fruits.
Yes, yeah. And just the interest and wanting to decorate your home with these objects, and also, you know, like the remnants of past parties and celebrations that made their way, you know, into the shelves of my home too. And it was so interesting when you talk about the rooster within, you know, and be next to the Rococo figurine. And I just right away thought of this photo I took not too long ago, in my parents' room, where there's these like shelves that are dedicated to figurines.
Hmm.
And you know, my dad is the one who purchases these figurines and then places them next to each other. And
Uh-huh.
they're, you know, it's so interesting because it's like there's European figurines, and then there's figurines that point towards rural life. And it makes
Hmm.
sense, right? And thinking about the calendars that they also put in the home that reference the rural life and this like fantastical, surrealist, like dreaming of like the landscape back in Mexico. That's also very,
Yes.
you know, naive and false at the same time. But it makes sense when thinking about where my parents came from, a rural
Hmm.
place, and longing for that. So I feel like there was always so much nostalgia, in the home, in these objects that made me want to investigate them, and you know, be interested in art. Like, why were they here? What is their meanings?
Absolutely. And to add another layer, I don't know if you've had this
Yeah.
experience, but I remember like there's this room that was the formal dining room in my grandparents' house. And that room had one of those big, like we call them like butacas, like this big like curio cabinet where
Mm,
you would have like these different, like the rooster and then the Rococo couple together. But it was also the place where my grandfather would like stash like the money that he would make. And sometimes I would like stumble into the money and like, play around with it. But I also like would find like Playboy magazines and shit too, like in his little stash.
mm,
And so, like, for me,
mhm,
it was also this way that, like, money, masculinity, like that was my grandfather's space, right? And so, like,
mm,
the roosters also symbolize a particular form of like virile, rural masculinity.
mm,
And then like it's almost this way in which like that underlying sort of sexuality, because Rococo paintings are super sexual,
yeah.
right? There's like the swing, which I think you have a work that you directly reference if you want to pull it up, right? Like and these other, Fragonard that you cite a lot, where like there are these scenes of this kind of sexuality that happens in a rural place, that's sort of a way,
Mhm,
and the landscape is this place of sort of like pleasure and leisure. And leisure is something that my family did not have much of, right? And so it was interesting. I think there is also a way that that Rococo aesthetic sort of like inserts leisure into a domestic space where folks are working constantly
mm,
and doing very like physical forms of labor. And so for me, I like these works in particular from high maintenance, especially the one on the right, really interested me when I first started to think through and like write about your work, and thinking about leisure. Like, I don't know if we can zoom into the homie that's like on the grass. I love this like reclining figure, because because I read them as masculine, and now I won't necessarily, but because I did, I was like, I love this homie that's like in his pink Nike outfit hanging out on the grass, right? But of course, like this, because of the ways in which like brown masculinities are perceived as criminal, we have like the toy figure behind him, like threatening him. Like there's always like leisure under threat, right? Or when these brown bodies that are read as masculine, it's almost like leisure is unavailable to them. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about like what led you to use the Rococo style to like tell these stories about like the constant threat of violence that that Latinx people are, especially those that are red, as dark brown, as immigrant face.
Yeah, it's within you know, those references of leisure, of like this idea of the fete gallant within the Rococo, of, you know, the scenes of lovers and you know, men and women partaking in, you know, court you know, dinners and dances, or you know, being in these scenes of lavishness and leisure,
Hmm.
that I really wanted to reference as a way of talking about present day leisure while these moments of militarization are happening.
Hmm.
So, you know, there is like a stark contrast between where both scenes are placed within the painting. Like you automatically see that there is a disconnect, that both of these situations, moments are happening at the same time, but not necessarily in the same place. And
Hmm.
I really wanted that tension to happen in order to talk about privilege, class, you know, while these apprehensions on the border are happening, or apprehensions, you know, in current US contemporary history, you know, outside of the border, within the US. While there's also moments of joy, moments of leisure by, you know, other groups that are really not necessarily interested in engaging with these moments, and caring for you know, these disposable bodies, all
Yeah.
in the same kind of landscape. And you know, in referencing the Rococo, you know, the scenes of pastoral images within the Rococo, I also like to sort of point towards my parents, you know, rural life back in Mexico, like that sort of landscape of where they come from, that there's this very important river that passes through that
Mm.
landscape, and the sort of meaning of it as a site and as a specific site that I'm referencing, but also, you know, the river that gets crossed to come into the US. And also on top of that, you know, the rivers and the waters, the bodies of water within the Rococo landscapes, all kind of conflating into one, you know, while referencing iconography that has double meanings for me, such as the Barbie slide. That's a reference to, you know, the Polly Pocket, the Barbie car, and another reference to my girlhood. But the Polly Pocket slide is this moment of contention where there's a moment of escaping, you know, and another painting that's not
I love
here,
that.
Ice Ice Lady, you know, where the figurine of the Ice Ice Lady is sort of underneath these layers of imagery that references the home, the interior of the Polly Pocket with Rococo. And then there's a slide as this kind of marker of being able to escape or to dream within these you know, moments of militarization.
I love that. I love that you always have that sort of ability to escape. And in the painting that you're referencing, that's not up here, I remember too. It's like a curvy, thicker, right, brown femme, and
Mhm.
that's also something that I, you know, as a thick femme, really
Mhm. Me
appreciate
too.
about your work. You know, we got caderas in the house, but
Yes.
I love that. And like what I love about your practice too is like, you know, I think to people like Judy Baca, Las Tres Marias, I'm thinking about like, you know, the attention to like self-adornment, and like it was only through that recent Radical Women Latin American art show that I learned that the back of that piece was like um velvet, like velvet, like plush velvet in the manner of like a customized car. And to
Ooh.
me, yeah, so like Judy Bacas Tres Marias in the back is like this like upholstered, I always say that wrong, upholstered velvet thing. So she's mixing in 1976, right? Like
Mm.
customizing of cars and like chola aesthetics, like within the same realm. And I love that, like, you know, you're entering as a Chicana into like this visual art history that's associated with mural making, that's associated with like very particular, I think, iconographies of like brown women, proud, very proud images, right? Uplifting images. And I think like you're following, these sort of generations that like Leticia Alvarado sort of talks about, like following Asco, following these other, Chicanx artists who start to be like less didactic and less sort of like mural making to more performance, more playing with conceptualism. And so here, like, to me, this is like what you're bringing into this history of Chicanx art in particular too, is like this attention to the feminine in a visual language that even now, like having lived in California for a bit, is still enamored with that like 1970s Chicano movement, like corn stalks. We want corn stalks and like queso cuatro, and we want like, these like Aztec iconography, and like you're bringing in something very different. And I just wonder if have you had my friends play around when they talk about like these like judgmental like woke Chicanos, like Chicano stores, but like have you had like Chicano stores be like, this is not, have you ever had like a critique of like, this is not the proper visual language for talking about these experiences of violence? And if you haven't had that, then I'm so happy, because then that means we really are in a different place.
I have had that, but not from, Latinx Chicano specifically.
Okay.
More from like white institutionalized professors and counterparts.
That's interesting. Oh my God, my mind is blown, because I would think it would be like some like, Chicano from previous generations being like, how dare.
And maybe just because I haven't necessarily engaged with, that a person that fits that criteria specifically, but maybe if I that they would have that kind of repulsion to it. But I've seen it more like on the other end where, and it's also this desire to make the work less pink, less excessive, just even thinking back to being in grad school, like there was a moment during one of my critiques where the critique was that, why hadn't I thought about making monuments, this installation of my monuments all white?
Wow, like literally?
Like literally, like literally.
Wow.
Like literally making the work all white, or being so repulsed by my video Really Safe in my room in America, and the images of contemporary violence, or feeling like, this was too excessive. And actually maybe there was, now that I'm thinking back, like a person who did maybe fit the criteria of Latinx, and being sort of worried that this kind of work was going to put me into this box of what kind of work I should be making. Who is now a fan of my work, ironically.
Amazing.
So I think,
that's why you have to do you.
Exactly, and I think my sort of protest to that was to always be excessive, do work that I felt naturally drawn to and interested and excited about making, regardless of what the institution or the art world deemed as high art in the moment. Like that to me was not exciting. And so I think, and maybe still, there is some rejection to it because of its excess, but
yeah,
I mean, that's exciting.
It is. And I think like just to, and we'll open it up for questions now, but like to sort of pick up on what you just said and bring it back to like the question that you asked about like these body aesthetics as resistance, is also, I think, what we do as Latinx, and maybe more particularly as Latinas, I think is like we take, and it's what Nicki Minaj does too. So I think just like racialized women from colonized places, I think what we do is like say, okay, like Barbie and pink is what women are supposed to be. Word, like I'll be that times 1,000. Like the resistance isn't saying like I'm actually going to like incorporate it, but in incorporating it through like my particular sort of like colonial history, it's going to be times like 1,000, right? And it's like infused with this kind of Baroque Rococo sensibility that is viewed as too much. But in the book I cite Pepon Osorio, who for sure is one of your, like, you know, you're in the line of Pepon Osorio too, and saying like, you know, excess in, you know, and he's speaking particularly of like Puerto Rican context, but like it's this idea of abundance, right? It's not this idea of too much in a bad way, it's this idea of abundance. So when I see your work, I think that what I appreciate so much about it is that like there is that Polly Pocket slide you can escape to. There is a moment of leisure, like you are paying attention to the violence, but there's pleasure there too. And I think that is probably what makes some viewers uncomfortable. And probably viewers, like you mentioned, like viewers with privilege who maybe don't know like how to consume it in an ethical way, because perhaps they feel it's more ethical to like ingest a more like dehumanized or more like pitiful representation like of subjection, whereas you're giving them something where they're like, is it cool for me to like enjoy this? And I think that's beautiful.
Yes.
So do you want to take some questions?
Yes, I think now is a perfect moment to open it up to the audience.
Do it.
Great. So we have one question.
Jara, if you want to join in.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So we have one question to start us off, and this one's for Yvette. Someone from the audience asks, can you speak about what materials you use in your work? And is there a friction between the opulence that's being shown and the materiality of the piece?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the materials that I use are paint, frosting, and plaster, depending on what you know, what I'm making. If it's an object, an installation, a painting, and I use all of these various materials using traditional cake decorating bags and tips. And so all the work is done by piping, as if I was, you know, decorating a cake, but onto various substrates. And the, you know, the lusciousness, the impermanence of frosting is a way for me to reference the, you know, impermanence of citizenship, the sort of impermanence of this idea of the American dream, while also talking about feminized ideas of labor, of women's work, and, you know, dismantling those ideas through my subject matter that's, you know, political and powerful in nature.
Does anyone have any additional questions that you'd like to submit by chat? Otherwise, I'm glad to keep things moving along, or would welcome the two of you to return to conversation. I wondered if I couldn't pry a bit to pull up one of the side conversations that the two of you started with, which was sort of talking about why you're not seeing American Latinx artists represented in perhaps like mainstream art circles, and wondered if you wanted to touch on that a little bit now that we've had some time to sort of think about like where our assumptions are around aesthetics of work.
I guess I can start. I mean, I think one thing I mentioned while we were having this conversation around that, maybe we can put Arlene Davila's book and mine in the chat whenever we have a second. But Yvette was mentioning Arlene Davila, who's a cultural theorist, just published a book on Latinx art, really talking about how Latinx artists really don't yet have a place within like the larger contemporary art market. And then I was thinking about, like, when I was telling Yvette, like, even in thinking about like who are some major Latina artists, like major Latina artists that you would think of, like if you thought of artists like Kara Walker or Wangechi Mutu or others. And, you know, most people would be like Ana Mendieta, who has passed, or Frida Kahlo, who has passed. you all can let me know if I'm missing someone. And it reminds me of a performance by Coco Fusco, who's one of the few artists that I think, you know, is sort of on that level of visibility. She had a project called Better When Dead that was about how Latinx women only accrue cultural value after they pass. So we can think about Selena, we can think about Frida Kahlo, we can think about Ana Mendieta, we can think about Eva Peron, like Jenny Rivera, right? So it's disturbing to think about the fact that Latinas only accrue value posthumously, right? And I think the idea, I think, is that we are bodies that are conflated with the most, along with Black women, we are conflated with domestic labor. We are not thought of as theorists or artists in the sort of wider imaginary. And I think as folks who have arrived later to the US, I think like we're just still sort of catching up to some of the recognition, which is still very recent for African American artists, right? Like I think, you know, it's going to be a while, I think, before we get to that. And then as an artist, Yvette, I don't know what your entry point is there.
Yeah, I think it's a reflection of, you know, these ideas of class and where we belong within class, like that we belong more to a working class, like how you're mentioning, you know, that our bodies are tied to labor and not necessarily in these spaces to dream and to you know, do research on, you know, our current contemporary history and to belong and be in these spaces that are a reflection of contemporary history. I think it also has a lot to do with the pay gap. You know, I think all of these things are interconnected. The fact that we make less than, you know, all of our other you know, women X counterparts says a lot about our position in society here. And yeah, I think that there is a sort of rejection, because I think that there's also this this idea that Latin American art sort of fills the void for Latinx art, and sometimes I think institutions and our white counterparts can conflate them as being the same. That Latin American art, you know, fills the Latinx box, when in reality, you know, it's a completely different experience, completely different experiences of race, class, and history of, you know, actually living and growing up in the US is really what marks us to want to use the term Latinx. It's a sort of word that, you know, that brings a sort of similarity in our vast experiences across race, color, language, all of these other factors that you know, vary across being labeled Latinx. And so I think once institutions start to acknowledge that, and I think maybe there is a beginning to that now, that we can be more represented, and I'm interested in being represented in the American contemporary history, you know, parts of these institutions, because this is American, you know, we're a part of American history. Like we are, you know, Latinx, but we're also part of contemporary US history. And I think there's maybe a long way for that to happen, but that's really, I think, where when that happens, I think that's when we belong, you know. And also, like, I don't know if it's important to belong in these institutions also, because I know we have other spaces where we dream and imagine and have like radical ideas of showing art and artist run spaces, and you know, other Latinx spaces that are supportive for us as artists, curators, writers. But I guess it is important in thinking about like the writing of contemporary art history, and yeah.
It's difficult. It's just difficult.
Yeah.
I think I haven't had, and someone talked about talking about pink as an aggressive weapon. I mean, I think I have not had so much resistance to recent research I've been trying to do than the work I've been trying to publish about the art of Yvette, the art of Sadie Barnett, um, Devin Galindo, and others who engage in this feminine language. And I think folks are not ready to really think about femme iconography as political iconography. And so for me, like the pink as a weapon of mass destruction goes back to like what we talked about earlier. Like pink made it so that even a cis white artist like Francois Boucher, who was at the top of the Rococo game, was like talked about really badly, right? So if pink is threatening to cis white European men, then what does it mean for people positioned like Yvette and myself to embrace that? And I'm actually really heartened by um, seeing Yvette enter these spaces, right? Like her practice is really entering the wider conversation in the way that she talked about. And I think, you know, in the academic circle that then I am trying to bring Yvette's work into, there's a different set, I think, for me of political hurdles that I'm starting to encounter. I'm starting to encounter some resistance as I'm trying to articulate this. So like I'm trying to actually theorize that. But that's also just been the story of my work. So like the book actually talks a lot about times where like my work just irritates people because I'm trying to, and I'm not even trying to valorize, like I'm not asking anyone to valorize us. I'm trying to tell our story, but in telling our story, like I happen to piss people off, like even Latinx and non-Latinx, but really like Latinx. I think there's a way, and Miami's a whole conversation Yvette and I can get into because Yvette, like, the politics of race and gender in Miami as a racialized space. So like meeting Yvette right after she had come from Miami, I'm like, I'm from Miami. And Yvette was kind of like, oh, and I was like, girl, about Miami, like, I'm here for it because in Miami, and I'm kind of an insider outsider. I lived in Miami for most of my life, but growing up in the Northeast and coming to Miami gave me like a really interesting like outsider view that I think saved my soul. But I think that like in Miami, the politics of belonging, I mean, look at the election, y'all, right? So like the Cuban American presence and like what belonging looks like in Miami, totally like very white aligned, very upper middle class performing. So to me, like it's really interesting, like aesthetics of excess in a place like Miami that's thought of as this like tropical, you know, sensual place that's thought of as diverse is actually an extremely difficult space to navigate to, where even Yvette was like, what's going on over there, right? So you know, even Latinx, like, you know, everyone in the election at post elections like, oh, why did Latinx vote for Trump? It's like, you know, we're not a homogenous group, and I think that's also maybe part of the problem with the Latinx art market thing, because like people don't know what to do with us, you know?
Yeah, and I think I feel like it was so formative too for me to be in Miami at that moment in time in 2016, 2017, and that I was going with this assumption that I was going to be accepted, by the communities of Miami, like the various Latinx communities, the Cubans, the Venezuelans, the Puerto Ricans, and the Mexicans, and so on and so forth. But to feel that I was sort of, I guess that was a space where I felt like my work was rejected by other Latinx, through its pink, through the iconography, like wondering why I was engaged in these conversations and like so political, but then also being reminded of my place. I remember I had asked like a curator, where the Mexican community was in Miami, because, I was interested in going to like the mom and pop shops and, scouting my material like I do here. And, she was so privy to right away sort of mark me in place and say like, oh, Mexicans are not here. They're usually they work in the field. So they're outside of Miami, like in the suburbs. I forgot what suburb she
whatever.
had.
Yes.
Yeah. Kind of like telling me like, you should be there too.
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Or like,
So I
don't
think
bother looking for them here in the real city because they're not.
right, exactly. So I think it also, you know, opened my experience of thinking about yeah, also thinking about Latinx, you know, people not as a monolith. Like even myself, I think I had been complacent in that too, and going with expectations and then, you know, understanding that like it's a whole different game of politics and class compared to growing up in the Midwest or
Absolutely.
being in, you know, California. I think those are maybe like Texas. The only
Right.
couple of other sites that I had engaged with that there is something very distinct about Miami, and it has to do with class and race.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the relationship to the border, because
Yeah.
you know the border for Miami is the water, and it's a
Mhm.
different encounter. And there have been in Miami very dramatic moments of Cuban migrants or Haitian migrants arriving through the water and being rejected. But these are like these very few like
Mhm.
spectacularized media moments. Whereas moving to California, I was like really struck by like you're driving on the 5 and there's border checkpoints, and it's like wait, like why is there a border, like we're in like in between San Diego and LA, there's a border checkpoint, right? And so it's I really became intimately aware that like the border is everywhere, right? And
Mhm.
once you move to the borderlands with Mexico, once you're moving through that space, you realize there's a very different type of relationship even to the body. So like even you know, I used to have like a little Cuban flag and Puerto Rican flag in my car that I like stopped using in California because of the checkpoint. And I'm like, you know, all of a sudden, like I had to think about the way that I was going to be viewed
Mhm.
in a way I never had to think about in Miami. Whereas, like in
Mhm.
California, it was like, well, when I drive down the 5, like I'm going to put my flags away because I'm not trying to get questioned, right,
Mhm.
by the folks there. So I think part of that complacency in Miami is like because Latinx are the majority and we don't have this particular relationship to the border, I think everyone thinks that they're fine. You know, like you don't need to be upset
Mhm.
with the system because we're okay. What are you mad at? You know,
Mhm.
we have some other things
Oh,
in the
interesting.
chat. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you to Christina. Totally down to be in
Yes.
conversation. Thank you, Lisa. Lisa's an amazing artist.
Oh. Hi, Paulina.
I'm also down with people like jumping in on video if you feel so called.
Yeah. Same. Yeah.
I saw Anya in the low key.
Oh, Anya.
Anya Wallace.
Jara, how are we on time?
We're at 6:10 right now, and we could go, you know, another 20 minutes if folks feel engaged. Up to the two of you. I know there was a question, let's see, that came up about how the two of you think of art as a philosophy and how the practice of protest, critique, refusal of binaries or other categories, and are those stances needed to be loud and aggressive, violent, or explicit, but is nonetheless impactful? Maybe we can unpack that a little bit together.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I'm unpacking that maybe is about methods for nuance or unexpected
Mm-hmm.
protest.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think just also, you know, being able to call myself an artist is, I think, protest in itself. Like to be in these spaces, in these white cube spaces, I think
I love that.
you know, for me functions already as protest, as critique, and refusal of these binaries. I think existing in these space and you know, showing the kind of work I'm making and the kind of conversations that I'm interested in having, that can seem, I guess, aggressive to some, but I think it depends on, you know, who the audience is. I'm not necessarily interested in having the work seem to be aggressive. I think, you know, to me, these conversations are contemporary, or are happening now, or critical to have, are normal. Um, and so, and I also think through, you know, the color palette, the material, how I was talking about earlier, like, you know, using these feminized notions of gendered labor to create the work, I think allows for an entry point in others ideas of gendered labor, and maybe at first glance viewing the work as just that is an entry point for them to then see that the work is about much more than just, you know, the pinks and the references of the frosting, although I think those in themselves are powerful. But I think, you know, thinking about other people's views on and assumptions on gendered colors and labor, I think that can also serve as an entry point into the work.
Yeah, I like that. You have a question from my dissertation advisor, and love Louisa Shine writes, I love the found object element of the work. When you are collecting, do you know why you are picking things and what you want them to say? Or do you pick first and let meaning emerge gradually?
That's a great question. Yeah, I pick first, and then I let them, you know, form meaning in the work, or find themselves in a work over time. Like they just sort of sit here in my studio as objects that make up my space, or make this space feel like mine. And you know, eventually I'll find a place for them to be in the work. But I think, you know, having their presence in the space definitely inspires me too. It's like it makes me feel like the sort of space that I want my work to feel like.
So do you find yourself picking by color as opposed to shape or content or whatever?
I think it's a mixture, by color, material, shine, glitter, hard, soft. I think it can be everything and anything in between.
Yeah, it's very cool that you make that material practice evident in the collecting too, not just in the rendering of the artworks themselves.
hmm Yeah, like in this piece specifically that's behind me has nails, collected nails, like acrylic nails that were on me and then now are on the piece, or other
Yes.
decals that were supposed to make their way on my nails but didn't. Um, what else is there? You know, printouts, collage. Um, so various, rings, broken down rings, keychains, various material that I think depending on the piece, like it naturally calls for certain objects to be in the piece. Mhm. But that's what's exciting to me about making the work, is not having it be so traditional. Because I come from a background of oil painting, and then I went to more sculptural based work, and then I came back to painting with more of looking at it more as a sculpture and less as a painting, if that makes sense. Mhm. Tamara, or let's see,
Yeah, you have a
Ernesto,
few more questions in the chat.
have you had any experiences with feeling like you are being tokenized by white curators or dealers? Definitely. Like I had mentioned my experience in Miami, I definitely felt like I was tokenized there. I've had experiences where I've had studio visits with people who specifically request to have studio visits with me in this building, or you know, who contact me because they're interested in my work, and then find their entry point to be offensive and diminishing. But I'm very quick to turn those conversations around and not engage, or, you know, counter them by using my, scholarly research and the way that I'm speaking to kind of place them back to, the conversations that I want to have. But yeah, I mean, that happens, but I'm not interested in engaging in it. Tamara, Yvette, can you talk more about the portraits you have made? Are they personal depictions? They are personal, and they're also more nuanced as like general portraits of not so specific people. But I want, when they're more nuanced in that way, I do want them to draw a certain a familiarity, like maybe they look like somebody that you may know, somebody from, Latinx identifying community may see someone, a relative of theirs in the work. But like for example, just because it's behind me in this painting, I do see this as a self-portrait, the female figure that's behind me, but I don't necessarily think it's important to say that or to make that clear. I sort of become like a stand-in for, the narrative I'm trying to say, or to make the work maybe more personal for me, but I don't necessarily think it's important for the audience to know that this figure is myself. I think it makes itself more visible and like in portraits like the portraits of my parents, where I'm specifically titling them portraits of the artist's parents after a painting that's made by Boucher that was a portrait of his daughter. So I'm like recontextualizing his work, his titling of his work to fit mine, and stating that they are my parents. But I think for that work specifically, it was important for me to state that and to make it apparent that they are my parents, because I was interested in having them become historical figures through the lens of Rococo painting. So I think it depends on what the work is.
Hi, Yvette. This is Tamara.
Hi, oh hi.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, because I think that you kind of play around with who's valuable to archive and who's valuable enough to use that kind of language. So yeah, I was kind of alluding to that kind of idea. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Thanks so much.
Definitely.
It's a great conversation.
Thank you so much for being here. It's so nice to hear your voice. It's interesting that that was the question that you were posing and like what you were trying to get at, because that was my thinking through creating those works, was using Rococo like I do in other works as this like landscape to then talk about immigrants, specifically like my parents, as like historical figures, but through the lens of like European traditional portraits, because they have specific significance. I'm not adding more significance to European art as being significance, but I'm sort of using it as a tool.
Yeah, there's a lot of subversion too. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. I mean, I also think even just like the Latin American last name or these kinds of significant identifiers within just like contemporary art in general, I think making that more common and kind of demanding that observation of these names or these kinds of figures is really important. So.
Definitely. Monica, can you talk more about the class relationship with Rococo style, particularly thinking about MDE? Madame du Pompadour. Okay. As a figure whose excesses led to the French Revolution.
Oh, so like, so I think Monica's referencing like maybe like Marie Antoinette, but they're all in the same gang of, deviant, perceived deviant European women. And I think like I'm interested in your high maintenance paintings in the white women figures. Like there's a figure that I think, and again, like I'm ascribing gender to them in my viewership. But in my viewership, I see one white woman ICE agent. I see white femmes, maybe I'll just say femmes. I see white femmes on looking. I don't know if you want to pull one of those up, like looking on to a scene where one of the figures is being apprehended. And I think the question of intersectionality and feminism that came up after the 2016 election and now like really resonated, I think, with that witnessing. But I think like one productive way of like, how do we get past the like, how do you get past calling out white women who are complicit with white supremacy? Well, we have a history. We have, to me, like the Nicki Rococo connection is a place to say white women and racialized women, we can sort of form alliances through the aesthetics of excess. You know, like if we reject, you know, white supremacy, if we reject the forms of valuation that we're talking about, the aesthetic forms of valuation that, like, for sure, going to Tamara's point, like your work is engaging in like who deserves to be put in these images, just like Kehinde Wiley and others, right, are using these European styles to say, I'm going to insert these figures into this work, and not because I'm trying to like make us legible or valuable, but those European aesthetics are ours also. Like we were colonized into them, so they are ours for the taking. You know, it's nothing outside. And I think, you know, I think like I understand earlier movements, both Chicanx, you know, Young Lords, Black Panther, and other movements that were like Afros, Negritude, like Back to Africa movements that were really rejecting any European aesthetics. But I do think that like we are in a moment where like if we really are going to contend with how colonialism has worked upon us, it is no less woke to use Rococo than it is to like use Aztec image. You know, like you don't need to go and use some Aztec imagery because we also don't have access to that either. You know what I'm saying? Like, so because of our fractured histories as colonized people, we can play with whatever we want, you know, like it's ours, you know, because colonialism made it so. So it's like if you're forcing me into this colonial situation, and if you're making it so that I can't access my like Taino ancestry or Arawak ancestry, then yeah, you know, I'm gonna play around with this because it's mine. You made it so, right?
So much so that it's, you know, ingrained in our celebratory practices 100%.
Right.
You know, in the decorations and what we eat and the way that, you know, dinners are served,
Quinceañera.
so on, yeah, so on and so forth.
Right, like the quinceañera herself as a Rococo object. And I have this like Rococo manifesto in my book where like I offer the quinceañera as a like, let's stop critiquing quinceañeras and think of them as, and I'm actually really stoked that I wrote that before this protest, because I'm like, I felt like it was like, oh my God, like, yes, right? Like quinceañeras, we can think of them, usually it's like, oh, Latinx culture, it's so backwards, they have these like quinceañeras, and it's like, for me, I'm like, no, look at how we celebrate our girls. Look at how like and yes, I'm not going to discount the patriarchal backdrop, but in practice, it's like, look at how we uphold girlhood, right? And then there's this protest that happened in 2017 where Latinx girls protested the Texas SB4 law that basically made it legal for police to ask people for their papers. And so they showed up at the Texas State House in their quinceañera dresses to protest, right? So like, you know, in this outfit that is supposed to signify patriarchy backwardness, right? Like ethnic excess, they're actually using it as this like political tool. And like there's an MTV video that follows them. And I love how there's a scene where they go into the state building and like all of them, like their skirts are like scratching the walls. And to me, it's like this beautiful vision of like what femme aesthetics can destroy, right? That
Yes.
the femme aesthetics, that their itchy, ballooned skirts are actually like agitating the walls of power. So it's all ours.
Yes. And just taking up space. I mean, even just in viewing this photo of them, you
Absolutely.
know, how dramatic and heavy these dresses are, and like in contrast with this like institutionalized building. I love that.
And if we just really want to quickly scroll down just to show you all like what I'm thinking of her, my next book project is like I'm interested in Yvette's work. This is an action by two Miami-based artists. There was a show of like Cristo's Surrounded Island, where Cristo in the 1980s had gone to Miami and like covered an island off the Keys in pink. And they used this exhibition to stage like an impromptu action where they wore these pink dresses. And you can go to the next slide, that were images of protesting gentrification and talking about like the environmental devastation that Miami is undergoing. So pink is showing up there. And then the next slide is Sadie Barnett's work. Her father was a Black Panther, was surveilled by COINTELPRO, and so she gets access to his FBI file and then modifies it through like these pink markings, and it's like her talking to her father as a girl. So it's called like Dear 1968, Love 1984. Using rhinestones, using pink to sort of talk back to the FBI and also like make these like markings of love to her father. So you know, for me, it's like pink as a weapon of mass destruction, of patriarchy, anti-Blackness, anti-immigrant sentiment. I mean, it's in the air right now. I think it's just we're entering a new moment of like what protests can look like, and it's a form of protest where femmes and femme iconography, I think, is at the vanguard of it. So that's my little, you know, that's a motto.
I think this is a great way to end.
I think so too.
The conversation. May the bridges I burn light the way.
For sure. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all so much
you
for
both.
your really mindful questions and joining the conversation. And thank you, Jill, too, for sharing your work with us and with me, and being, you know, an inspirational figure in my practice too.
Thank you, Yvette. You are totally.
Everybody needs to. Everyone needs to get a copy of this book. Look at how amazing it is.
I love it. Like Yvette sent me a picture of her nails holding like the book with all the tabs, and I just got my entire life with that. But I think next, Yvette, like I think we need to do like a collaborative art piece together. So I think that
would be amazing.
I think that'll be the next thing. So if anyone wants to underwrite that, you know who to talk to. We are here for that conversation.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Yvette. Thank you, Jillian. As people head out, I just wanted to drop a note that Yvette will be in conversation with Robert Casalino on December 8th at 5 p.m. I'll be sending out a link for that shortly. And we also encourage you to follow Yvette's project on Instagram. You can follow our handle at La Warsha Gallery, or Yvette, if you feel comfortable, you're welcome to share yours. And we also welcome you to donate shoes to Yvette's current project, Monuments of the Forgotten, and you can check out our Insta for more information. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Mhm.